In 1870, a locomotive hauled 198 tons up gradients of 1 in 40, around curves tighter than 100 feet, on rails barely 2 feet apart. It outperformed every conventional engine on the line. Engineers from 3 continents came to witness the demonstration. Within a generation, nearly every railway in the world had rejected the design entirely. These were forgotten experimental locomotives that tested the absolute limits of steam rail technology, machines that solved problems no standard engine could touch, yet carried a hidden cost that no amount of engineering brilliance could overcome. To understand why, you have to start with the terrain that made them necessary. Slate railways in North Wales were built through terrain that defied standard engineering logic. The Fairlie Railway, for example, was laid out with gradients as steep as 1 in 40, meaning the track climbed 1 foot for every 40 feet of distance. Over long stretches, the line kept up this relentless pitch, pushing locomotives to their traction limits, especially on damp or icy rails. Sharp curves compounded the problem. The original alignment included bends with radii as tight as 80 feet and many more under 100 feet. On these curves, the rigid frames of conventional locomotives strained against the rails, risking derailment and excessive flange wear. The gauge itself, just under 2 feet wide, imposed its own restrictions. Boiler diameters had to be kept below 24 inches, often closer to 20, simply to fit through tunnels and under bridges. This limited both the heating surface and firebox size, capping the amount of steam a locomotive could generate at any one time. Engineers found themselves boxed in by the landscape. They needed engines that could grip steep inclines, snake around abrupt bends, and still fit within the narrow loading gauge. The physical environment set boundaries that conventional locomotive designs could not easily cross, forcing a search for more radical solutions. Heavy slate trains on the Fairlie Railway routinely tipped the scales at over 80 tons, sometimes stretching to 200 tons during peak haulage. Each load demanded that locomotives deliver every ounce of grip, especially on wet mornings when rails turned slick. But adhesion wasn't the only concern. Every trip up or down the line involved a logistical penalty. Conventional engines, built on rigid frame designs, could not run equally well in both directions. At each terminus, crews faced a mandatory runaround maneuver, uncoupling, shunting, and recoupling the engine to the other end of the train. Even when executed smoothly, this process cost at least 10 minutes per cycle. Multiply that delay across dozens of trains per week, and the timetable began to sag under its own weight. Stalls on the steepest grades became a regular entry in the operating log. Once or twice a week, a train would lose traction halfway up a 1 in 40 incline, forcing the crew to back down and try again. These delays rippled outward, disrupting the entire day's schedule and risking missed connections at the port. The limits of rigid frame design were not just technical, they were economic. Every lost minute, every failed ascent translated into higher costs and reduced capacity. For a railway built to move as much slate as possible, these inefficiencies threatened the bottom line as much as any engineering challenge. Robert Fairlie's 1864 patent did not simply propose a new locomotive, it redrew the blueprint for how steam engines could grip the rails and bend around impossible curves. The heart of his design was a double-ended boiler mounted lengthwise along a rigid central frame. This boiler did not rest on a fixed undercarriage. Instead, it perched atop 2 swiveling bogies, each carrying its own pair of driving axles and cylinders. Every wheel beneath the engine was powered, and crucially, every wheel could pivot independently beneath the weight of the locomotive. The logic behind this arrangement was as much mathematical as mechanical. Traditional engines, with their rigid wheelbases, distributed only a fraction of their total mass onto the driving wheels. Idle axles, pony trucks, or trailing wheels soaked up weight that could have been used for traction. Fairlie's twin bogie system, by contrast, placed nearly 100% of the locomotive's mass directly above its powered wheels. This meant that in theory, every pound of the engine contributed to adhesive force, maximizing the tractive effort available for steep climbs and heavy loads. At the center of the frame, Fairlie positioned a firebox that fed two boilers set back to back. Each boiler supplied steam to its own set of cylinders, which were mounted on the bogies themselves. The patent diagrams show a kingpin at each end of the frame, serving as the pivot point for the bogies. These kingpins were not simple bolts. They formed the axis around which the entire engine could articulate, allowing the front and rear bogies to swing independently as the locomotive entered tight curves. The geometry of these pivots was carefully specified, enough lateral freedom to negotiate 80-foot radius bends, but with stops to limit over rotation and maintain pivot stability at speed. The transfer of steam from the stationary boiler to the moving bogies required a leap in pipework design. Fairlie's patent described the use of flexible spherical steam joints, essentially ball and socket assemblies, capable of maintaining a seal under pressures of 90 to 150 pounds per square inch, while allowing the bogies to rotate up to 15 degrees in either direction. Early versions experimented with bellows joints, but these proved vulnerable to cinder abrasion and thermal fatigue. So the design shifted to cast iron ball joints, caulked with soft metal and held tight by compression straps. Water lines, meanwhile, were routed through heavy leather or rubber-lined hoses, riveted for pressure and flexibility, snaking from the tank to each bogie as it swung beneath the frame. The entire weight of the locomotive, firebox, water tanks, crew, and all, rested on the two bogies. There was no dead weight carried on unpowered wheels. The patent's calculations, confirmed in later technical reviews, showed that adhesive weight equaled total engine weight, a rarity in steam locomotive design. For a typical Fairlie of the era, this meant 15 tons or more pressing every driving wheel into the railhead, a figure that dwarfed the 60 to 70% adhesion typical of conventional engines. Fairlie's architecture also solved the problem of bi-directional running. With identical bogies at each end and a central cab, the locomotive could run equally well in either direction. No turntable required. The crew stood between the two boilers, with the driver operating dual sets of controls and the fireman feeding coal sideways into the central firebox. This arrangement, while efficient on paper, created a cramped and stifling workspace, but it allowed the engine to reverse at a moment's notice, essential for shunting and for lines with no space for turning. The patent text spelled out the logic in plain terms. By mounting the boilers centrally and allowing each bogie to pivot freely, the entire engine could pass around curves of the smallest radius while maintaining all weight upon the driving wheels. In practice, this translated into a machine that could haul massive trains up 1 in 40 gradients and snake around 80-foot bends without slipping or derailing. This was a feat that conventional rigid frame engines could not match on the same track. Every detail, from the kingpin geometry to the flexible joints and the placement of the cab, was aimed at one goal: to extract the maximum possible adhesion and maneuverability from the narrow-gauge rails of North Wales. The design's mathematical elegance promised a revolution in railway traction, at least on paper. The next step was to prove that this radical architecture could withstand the realities of daily service. That test would soon be on the Festiniog line. Little Wonder arrived on the Festiniog Railway in late 1869, its double-boiler frame and swiveling bogies drawing immediate scrutiny from engineers and railway officials. The pressure to deliver was intense. The line's directors, facing weekly stalls and mounting delays from conventional engines, demanded proof that Fairlie's radical design could outperform anything that had come before. They did not have to wait long. In March 1870, a series of public trials put Little Wonder to the test. The railway's operating logs recorded the details: 18 slate wagons and a brake van, a total of 198 tons including the engine, coupled into a single train. The route from Duff's to Boston Lodge, just over a mile, included some of the steepest gradients and tightest curves on the entire line. sections where fixed-frame locomotives routinely slipped or derailed. The weather offered no favors. Damp air clung to the rails, a common enemy of adhesion. With the board of directors and visiting inspectors assembled trackside, the crew fired up Little Wonder. The engine's central cab, wedged between two boilers, left barely enough room for the driver and firemen to work. The firemen shoveled coal sideways into the firebox as the locomotive lurched forward, both bogies pivoting smoothly into the first 100-foot radius curve. The entire weight of the engine pressed into the rails, every wheel powered, every axle engaged. There was no idle mass, no trailing truck to siphon off adhesion. Observers noted the absence of wheel slip, even as the train climbed a 1 in 50 gradient. The pressure gauge hovered around 130 pounds per square inch, and the drawbar pull exceeded 6,000 pounds force at the steepest section, numbers that dwarfed the efforts of the railway's existing engines. Where the small England class had stalled with 120 tons, Little Wonder surged ahead with nearly 200, rounding curves that had defeated every previous design. The logs show the loaded run to the summit completed in under 12 minutes. The return, downhill but still treacherous, took just as long, with the engine's bidirectional controls allowing an immediate reversal at the terminus. No runaround, no lost time. The trial was not witnessed in silence. The Engineer and Railway News sent correspondents whose reports described the spectacle of a train nearly 400 yards long, snaking around bends that would have been impossible for a rigid-framed engine. The directors, led by C.E. Spooner, watched as Little Wonder negotiated the sharpest curves without a hint of derailment or flange binding. When the train crested the summit, the inspectors recorded their verdict. The Fairlie design had delivered exactly what the railway needed: superior adhesion, unmatched flexibility, and a dramatic reduction in turnaround time. The results reverberated beyond North Wales. Within weeks, engineers from as far as Russia and the United States requested technical drawings and performance logs. The Festiniog board granted Fairlie a perpetual, royalty-free license, a rare concession that signaled confidence in the design's future. Traffic records for the months following the trials show Little Wonder hauling the majority of heavy mineral trains, freeing up older engines for lighter duties and reducing daily delays. Yet even as the trials confirmed the engine's capabilities, questions lingered beneath the surface. Inspectors also noted the complexity of the flexible steam joints and the cramped, overheated cab. Maintenance crews logged extra hours tending to the spherical couplings and the central firebox. For the moment, though, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Little Wonder had solved the immediate problems of traction, curve negotiation, and bidirectional running on the Festiniog. The locomotive's mechanical brilliance was now a matter of record, its success witnessed by railway officials, engineers, and the skeptical eyes of the press. Steam under pressure is relentless. Inside a double Fairlie, it coursed through a network of pipes and joints that had to flex and seal at the same time. No easy feat when the entire engine could twist up to 15 degrees on a tight curve. The core of this flexibility was the spherical steam coupling, a ball and socket joint of cast iron caulked with soft metals like lead or copper, held in place by compression straps. This geometry allowed each bogie to swing laterally beneath the boiler, keeping steam flowing to the cylinders even while the locomotive bent around an 80-foot radius. But every advantage came at a physical cost. The spherical joint by design had to maintain a perfect seal under pressures that routinely reached 130 or even 150 pounds per square inch, all while moving through its arc. Each time the locomotive entered a curve, the joint's internal surfaces slid against each other, spreading the load across a narrow ring of metal. Over time, this constant movement introduced material fatigue. Small imperfections in the casting or caulking could grow into leaks, especially as thermal expansion and contraction worked the soft metal out of its seat. Bellows-style joints. Another early experiment used concentric steel rings riveted in an accordion shape to flex with the motion of the bogie. On paper, these bellows could accommodate even greater angles, but in practice they quickly fell victim to the realities of the railway environment. Coal cinders and ash thrown up from the firebox and track settled into the folds. Each oscillation of the bellows ground these abrasive particles into the seams, eventually forcing them open. Once a single seam was breached, steam would escape at high velocity, eroding the metal further and creating a runaway failure. Maintenance logs from the period note that bellows joints, when used near the firebox, often required replacement after only a few months of service. The physics of these failures were straightforward. Every degree of articulation increased the mechanical stress at the joint. At the maximum swing, typically 15 degrees in either direction, the contact patch inside the spherical coupling shifted toward the edge, concentrating force and risking deformation. The cast iron of the period, while strong in compression, was brittle under repeated flexing, especially when subjected to the heat cycles of daily operation. Engineers tried to mitigate this by increasing the thickness of the ball and socket, but this added weight and made the joint harder to keep steam tight. Water lines faced similar challenges. Early designs routed water through heavy leather or rubber-lined hoses riveted to withstand pressures up to 150 pounds per square inch. But as the bogies swung beneath the engine, these hoses flexed and twisted, their seams strained by repeated motion. Any misalignment between the fixed frame and the moving bogie could cause the hose to kink or chafe against the undercarriage. The result was a gradual thinning of the hose wall and eventually a catastrophic rupture. Workshop notes from the Fairlie shops describe frequent replacements, with hoses weighing as much as 85 pounds per 50 feet, a burden for both the engine and the maintenance crew. Thermal cycling compounded the problem. As the locomotive heated up and cooled down, the joints expanded and contracted. Soft metals used for caulking could lose their grip, allowing leaks to develop at the flanges. Crews carried caulking tools specifically for this purpose, patching joints between runs to keep the engine in service. Still, even the best repairs offered only a temporary reprieve. The constant interplay of pressure, heat, motion, and abrasion meant that no joint could remain perfectly tight for long. No catastrophic failures are recorded in the surviving reports, but the pattern of fatigue is clear. Spherical joints, while ingenious, became maintenance bottlenecks. Bellows joints, defeated by cinder abrasion, were quickly abandoned. The very flexibility that allowed Fairlie's locomotives to conquer impossible curves also created a new set of vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities would shape the fate of every articulated design that followed. Inside the cab of a double Fairlie, the promise of engineering innovation collided with the daily reality of human endurance. Crews quickly named it the skillet. With a boiler on either side, the cab became a narrow channel of heat where temperatures routinely soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the depths of a Welsh winter. The fireman's job was to keep both boilers fed, shoveling coal sideways into a central firebox that never stopped demanding fuel. Unlike the broad, open footplates of standard engines, the Fairlie's cramped workspace left little room to maneuver. Every swing of the shovel had to be precise, yet the engine's constant motion, twisting on curves and lurching over joints, turned the act of firing into a test of balance and stamina. Service logs from the Fairlie workshops tell the other side of the story. Maintenance was not just a routine, but a cycle of vigilance and repair that shaped the working lives of fitters and boilermakers. After as little as 500 miles, barely a week's work on the mineral circuit, each locomotive returned to the shed for inspection. The flexible hoses that carried water from the tanks to the boilers weighed 85 pounds each, their bulk and stiffness a constant challenge for the men tasked with removing, checking, and reinstalling them. Workshop ledgers show hours allocated not just to standard lubrication and cleaning, but to the more specialized tasks of repacking steam joints, recocking flanges with soft metal, and patching leaks that developed from thermal cycling and constant vibration. For the firemen, every shift was a battle against heat and awkward ergonomics. Boots sometimes stuck to the floor, where spilled coal dust and cinders baked into a sticky crust. Shirts were soaked through before the first summit was reached. The sideways firing motion necessary to feed the centrally located firebox led to strained backs and blistered hands. On steep gradients, the need for a steady, even fire was unrelenting, and any lapse meant a drop in boiler pressure, risking a stall on the incline and a cascade of schedule delays. The driver, too, faced constant physical strain wedged between the boilers, hands never far from the throttle and brake, eyes darting between the dual sets of controls and the track ahead. Workshop notes from the period reveal the scale of the maintenance burden. Spherical steam joints, while essential for the engine's flexibility, demanded frequent attention. Caulking tools became as vital as wrenches. Any sign of a leak, often betrayed by a thin jet of steam or a whiff of hot oil, meant the engine could not be trusted for another run without repair. The hoses, heavy and awkward, required teams of men to handle safely. Records show that a single hose replacement or joint repacking could take several hours, often extending a routine service into a full day's work. The human cost was not limited to exhaustion or discomfort. Service logs detail minor injuries, such as scalds from escaping steam, burns from hot metal, and the ever-present risk of slips on oily, coal-dusted floors. Fitters developed a rhythm, moving from one engine to the next, each with its own quirks and chronic issues. The maintenance cycle was relentless. Engines in for inspection, hoses off for weighing and checking, joints opened and resealed, all against the ticking clock of the railway timetable. Despite these burdens, the Fairlie engines delivered on their promise of power and innovation. They hauled heavier trains with fewer delays, reduced the need for runarounds, and conquered curves that defeated conventional designs. But every advantage on the rails translated into extra hours in the workshop and harder shifts for the crew. The day-to-day reality of operating and maintaining these machines exposed the hidden costs of innovation, a price paid not just in materials and labor, but in sweat, fatigue, and the constant vigilance of those who kept the engines running. Single Fairlie locomotives, stripped down to a single boiler and one powered bogie, were an immediate response to the operational headaches exposed by their double-ended predecessors. The idea was simple: keep the articulation and adhesive weight, but reduce the complexity that made maintenance a constant battle. The Festiniog Railway's Josephine was among the first to put this theory to the test. On paper, her lighter frame and single set of driving wheels promised easier servicing and better crew conditions. In the field, results were mixed. Josephine handled the sharp curves and steep gradients with nearly the same agility as the double Fairlies, but her tractive effort dropped. She could haul respectable loads, yet struggled on the heaviest slate trains, especially in wet weather when every pound of adhesion mattered. Logbooks from the 1870s show a pattern. Josephine worked reliably on lighter schedules, but during peak slate traffic, the railway reverted to double Fairlies for their sheer pulling power. Elsewhere, engineers tried to adapt the Fairlie concept to broader gauges and different climates. In Jamaica, a double Fairlie was rebuilt into a single-ended format, hoping to reduce maintenance on the island's rough, humid tracks. The conversion simplified the steam pipework and eliminated one set of flexible joints, but it also shifted more of the locomotive's weight onto a single bogie. This led to a new problem: rail spreading. With axle loads creeping above 12 tons on the 3-foot 6-inch gauge, maintenance crews began recording incidents where the rails bowed outward under the concentrated weight. The Jamaican logbooks list several derailments on poorly ballasted sections, each traced back to excessive point loading at the bogie pivots. The trade-off was clear. While the single Fairlie reduced internal complexity, it exposed the track to new stresses that conventional engines, with their distributed wheelbases, rarely caused. Queensland Railways in Australia took the experiment a step further, commissioning a test unit for their expanding narrow-gauge network. The Queensland Fairlie boasted a modified layout, a single central boiler, one powered bogie, and a trailing truck designed to spread weight more evenly. Early runs over the Toowoomba Range showed promise. The locomotive negotiated 5 chain curves and 1 in 50 gradients without stalling, matching the performance of imported British engines on paper. But as the test program continued, new drawbacks surfaced. The articulated bogie, now carrying a disproportionate share of the locomotive's mass, accelerated wear on both wheels and track. Axle loads measured by the railway's engineers showed values consistently above the recommended limits for the lightly built rails, often exceeding 12 tons per axle. Within the first year, rail spreading incidents multiplied, and maintenance costs for both the locomotive and the permanent way began to climb. Across all these trials, a pattern emerged. The single and modified Fairlies delivered their best results on lines where curves and gradients were extreme and where traffic volumes justified the added maintenance. On more forgiving terrain or where track standards were marginal, the very features that made these engines innovative became liabilities. Axle load data from Jamaica and Queensland, preserved in engineers' reports, pointed to a hard limit. Beyond 12 tons per axle, the risks of track damage and derailment rose sharply. The logbooks tell the story in numbers: more time spent re-railing, more money spent on track repairs, and a gradual retreat from articulated experiments in favor of simpler, lighter engines. The engineering logic was inescapable. What worked brilliantly in the slate country of North Wales did not always translate to broader gauges or different operating conditions. Each field test, whether in the mountains of Wales or the cane fields of Jamaica, revealed the same contradiction. Technical success in one domain often meant new weaknesses in another. The search for a universal solution to the problem of traction always circled back to the realities of the rails beneath the wheels. Railway superintendents, charged with keeping schedules tight and budgets in check, soon faced a dilemma that stretched beyond the workshop floor. The articulated locomotives, Fairlies, and their kin delivered remarkable feats on paper and in early trials, but every hour saved on the rails seemed to demand 2 more in the shed. Maintenance ledgers from the late 19th century, preserved in the margins of board minutes and consumables accounts, reveal a pattern that would shape the fate of these machines. By the 1890s, railway boards scrutinized every shilling spent on fuel, lubricants, and spare parts. The cost of keeping a double Fairlie in service began to stand out. Consumables, coal, oil, water, and packing materials ran at a premium. Internal memos from Swindon Works, dated 1895, drew a sharp comparison. Articulated locomotives consumed up to 25% more in routine supplies than standard engines of similar output. This was not just a matter of heavier trains or steeper grades. The design itself, with its twin boilers, flexible steam joints, and complex pipework, demanded more frequent attention. Every joint, every hose, every caulked flange was a potential leak, and each repair consumed time, material, and manpower. The procurement policy at major works like Swindon grew increasingly conservative. Board minutes show a shift in priorities. Durability and interchangeability trumped raw performance. Locomotive committees, reviewing maintenance logs and cost breakdowns, saw the numbers tilt against the articulated experiments. An engine that could outperform its rivals on a test track might still spend a quarter of its service life sidelined for repairs. The consumables ledger told its own story: oil and packing for the spherical joints, extra coal for the less efficient firing arrangement, and a steady stream of replacement hoses and caulking metal. In a fleet of a dozen engines, these costs multiplied until they threatened to swamp the savings from faster turnarounds or heavier trains. Standardization offered a way out. As railway networks expanded and interlinked, the case for uniformity grew. Parts could be shared across classes, repairs streamlined, and crews trained on a single pattern of operation. Articulated designs, with their unique fittings and specialized maintenance needs, became liabilities in an era moving toward mass production and predictable schedules. Even where Fairlies had proven themselves on the Festiniog, in Jamaica or Queensland, the broader industry saw them as outliers. The underlying arithmetic was hard to ignore. For every pound spent on a standard locomotive, a Fairlie might demand £1 and 5 shillings, with no guarantee of longer service intervals or easier repairs. The institutional verdict was delivered not with a single decree, but through 1,000 small decisions. Procurement committees favored the tried and true. Workshop managers lobbied for engines that could be kept running with off-the-shelf parts. The Swindon Memo of 1895, terse but decisive, captured the mood. It stated that articulated locomotives would not be added to the standard fleet. The promise of flexibility and power had met its match in the cold logic of the balance sheet and the relentless drive for operational simplicity. By the turn of the century, the experimental articulated locomotives had been pushed to the margins. Their strengths, adhesion, bidirectional running, and curve negotiation remained undeniable in the right context, but the costs, both visible and hidden, outweighed the benefits for most operators. The era of radical steam innovation closed not with a spectacular failure, but with a quiet, calculated retreat toward engines that could be built, maintained, and repaired by the book. The lesson, written in the ledgers and board minutes, was clear. In the industrial age, even brilliance must answer to the bottom line. Today, the tension between engineering ambition and operational reality shapes every breakthrough in transport technology. High-performance designs still collide with the realities of maintenance, cost, and system compatibility. As railways pursue new forms of traction and automation, the lessons from these experimental machines remain urgent. Innovation alone is not enough. Only what endures in daily service changes the network. Progress demands brilliance, yes, but it also demands hard-won pragmatism. Thanks for watching, and join the discussion below.